The world does not end with a bang in the way that poets imagine it. It does not end with a single defining explosion that scours the earth clean and leaves behind a silent, smoldering planet. No, the world ends in fragments. It ends in the static hiss of a television screen broadcasting a signal that has suddenly, inexplicably, gone dead. It ends in the terrified whisper of a mother in Tehran, pressing her children against a wall away from the windows, her hand clamped over her own mouth to stop herself from screaming. It ends in the frantic coded messages flashing across encrypted channels, messages that spell out in cold digital text what no one dares to say aloud. The unthinkable has happened. The head of the snake has been severed, and the body, a sprawling 70 million armed beast, is thrashing in its death throes, unaware that it is already dead. The strikes came without warning, which is the only kind of strike that truly matters. For weeks, the rhetoric had been building, a predictable crescendo of threat and counter-threat that had become the background radiation of life in the Middle East. The United States and Israel had issued their ultimatums. Iran had responded with its customary defiance, parading its missiles through the streets of Tehran, its leaders standing on stages draped in flags the size of buildings, promising a response that would wipe their enemies from the pages of history. It was a script that had been performed so many times that everyone had stopped listening to the words. But this time, the actors had changed the dialogue. This time, the ultimatum was not a warning, it was a deadline. And when the deadline passed, the silence that followed was not the silence of restraint. It was the silence of a predator drawing a breath before it strikes. The first indication that something was different came not from a military source, but from a civilian one. A satellite internet provider in eastern Syria reported a sudden, catastrophic loss of signal in the vicinity of the Damascus-Beirut highway. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the electronic grid in western Iran began to flicker and fail, not in a cascading blackout, but in a series of precision cuts, as if a surgeon were methodically severing the neural pathways of a patient on the table. The strikes were not the indiscriminate rain of bombs that had characterized the wars of the past. They were something new. They were something terrifying. They were a symphony of destruction conducted by algorithms and artificial intelligence, a swarm of drones and missiles that moved through the air like a school of fish, communicating with each other, adjusting their trajectories in real time, hunting not for buildings but for people. The target, the primary target, the only target that mattered in the grand calculus of the operation, was a convoy moving through the suburbs of southern Tehran. It was not a military convoy in the traditional sense. There were no tanks, no missile launchers, no visible displays of force. It was a convoy of unmarked sedans and SUVs, the kind of vehicles that blend into the chaotic traffic of a sprawling metropolis. But these vehicles were not carrying businessmen or government functionaries. They were carrying the future of Iran. In the lead vehicle, protected by layers of encryption and human shields, sat the man who had been the face of the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the ultimate authority on matters of faith and state, the man whose word was law for millions of Shia Muslims around the world, was on the move. He was fleeing a threat that his intelligence services had assured him was hours away. He was fleeing a strike that had already happened. The world learned of his fate not through an official announcement, but through the digital breadcrumbs that trail every modern catastrophe. A low-resolution video, filmed from a balcony in a Tehran high-rise, showed a series of flashes on the horizon, too rapid to count, too bright to ignore. Then came the sound, a rolling thunder that shook the camera and rattled the windows of apartments for miles around. Then came the silence. And then, most damning of all, came the chatter. On Telegram channels affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the tone shifted from defiance to confusion, then from confusion to a frantic, coded desperation. Phrases like, "May God protect our leader," and "Pray for the soul of the faithful," began to appear, only to be deleted seconds later. The algorithms that monitor global sentiment for intelligence agencies around the world registered a spike in keywords that no algorithm ever wants to see: succession, power vacuum, civil war. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was the first to break the silence with a statement that was less an announcement and more a coronation. He appeared before a hastily assembled press conference in Tel Aviv, his face a mask of solemn triumph, the kind of expression worn by men who have just done something that will be written about in history books for 1,000 years. He did not show proof of death. He did not need to. In the theater of modern warfare, ambiguity is a weapon more powerful than certainty. He spoke of a decapitation strike, of the removal of the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism, of a new dawn for the people of Iran. He called on the Iranian military to lay down its arms, to turn against its own commanders, to embrace the freedom that he claimed was now within their grasp. It was a speech designed not to inform, but to inflame, and it worked. Within hours, the streets of Tehran, which had been empty and silent in the immediate aftermath of the strikes, began to fill with people. But they were not the people the regime had expected. They were not the besieged militias, the fanatical loyalists who had been trained to suppress dissent with clubs and bullets. They were the people of the revolution, the ghosts of 1979, but this time, they were marching in the opposite direction. They were the women who had been beaten for removing their headscarves, the students who had been shot for attending protests, the fathers who had watched their sons disappear into the dungeons of Evin prison. They poured into the streets not with pictures of the supreme leader, but without them. They chanted not slogans of loyalty, but slogans of liberation. They tore down posters of Khamenei and trampled them underfoot. They danced in the smoke, and in their dancing was the terrible, beautiful promise of freedom and the even more terrible certainty of the violence that would come to crush it. The violence came, as it always does, from multiple directions at once. The IRGC, stunned and leaderless but far from defeated, attempted to mobilize its remaining forces. But the chain of command, that rigid hierarchy that had kept the regime in power for so long, had been shattered. In the absence of the supreme leader, there was no clear authority. Different factions within the Guard, different commanders with different loyalties and different ambitions began to issue conflicting orders. Some called for an immediate, overwhelming retaliation against Israel and American assets in the region. Others, more pragmatic or more terrified, counseled restraint, urging a focus on internal security, on preserving what was left of the regime before the wolves closed in. In the chaos, the hardliners prevailed, at least initially. Missiles, launched from hidden silos in the Zagros Mountains, arced toward Israel, only to be intercepted by the Iron Dome and its more mysterious, more capable American counterparts. Drones, swarms of them, descended on American bases in Iraq and Syria, killing dozens of soldiers and contractors in attacks that were as indiscriminate as they were furious. The American response was immediate and devastating. President Matthew Thompson, a man whose entire political career had been built on the promise of restoring American strength and projecting power abroad, addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He stood behind the resolute desk, his face illuminated by the harsh lights of the television cameras, and he spoke in the measured, deliberate tones of a man who has just made a decision that will define his legacy forever. He confirmed the death of the supreme leader. He confirmed the ongoing strikes against Iranian military targets. He warned the Iranian people not to interfere with the liberation of their own country. And then he delivered the line that would be replayed 1,000,000 times in the days to come. The line that would be parsed and analyzed by every strategist and every historian. "We did not start this war," he said, "but by God we will finish it." But finishing a war is not the same as winning it. And in the hours that followed the president's address, it became clear that the war was only just beginning. The strikes on the convoy had been a success, a tactical masterpiece that would be studied in military academies for generations. But the strategic consequences were unfolding in real time, and they were not the consequences that the planners in Washington and Tel Aviv had anticipated. They had expected the regime to collapse. They had expected the people to rise up and embrace their liberators. They had expected a swift, decisive end to 45 years of hostility and tension. What they got was chaos. What they got was a vacuum, and nature, as every schoolchild knows, abhors a vacuum. The vacuum in Iran was filled within days by a dozen different forces pulling in a dozen different directions. In the north, near the Caspian Sea, elements of the regular Iranian army, the Artesh, declared their neutrality, refusing to fire on their own people, but also refusing to join the IRGC in its doomed counteroffensive. In the south, in the oil-rich provinces of Khuzestan and Bushehr, separatist movements that had been simmering for decades seized their moment, declaring autonomy and seizing control of oil fields and refineries, cutting off the lifeblood of the Iranian economy. In the east, along the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan, Sunni militant groups, long suppressed by the Shia regime, emerged from the shadows, attacking military convoys and capturing towns, their black flags rising over villages that had never known anything but the green of the Islamic Republic. And in Tehran, the heart of the beast, the situation was most volatile of all. The protests that had erupted in the immediate aftermath of the strikes had not been crushed. They had grown. They had spread from the working-class neighborhoods of the South to the affluent boulevards of the North. They had united students and shopkeepers, clerics and secularists, women in chadors and women in jeans, all of them bound together by a single intoxicating, terrifying emotion: hope. They occupied Azadi Square, the symbolic heart of the revolution, and they declared it free territory. They set up barricades and checkpoints. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: hunting rifles and kitchen knives and, in some cases, weapons taken from police stations that had been abandoned by their terrified guards. But the regime, even in its death throes, was not finished. The hardliners, those whose very lives depended on the survival of the Islamic Republic, gathered in the holy city of Qom, beneath the golden dome of the shrine of Fatima Masumeh. They convened an emergency session of the Assembly of Experts, the body theoretically responsible for selecting a new supreme leader. But the assembly was as divided as the country itself. Some pushed for the swift elevation of Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, hoping to establish a dynastic succession that would preserve the core of the regime. Others, more ideologically pure, argued for a cleric of unimpeachable revolutionary credentials, a man like Ahmad Khatami, whose fiery sermons had inspired generations of martyrs. The debates held behind closed doors in the ancient city were bitter, violent, and ultimately inconclusive. They emerged not with a new leader, but with a fatwa, a religious edict declaring the protests in Tehran to be an act of war against God himself and calling on all faithful Muslims to take up arms in defense of the revolution. The fatwa was the spark that lit the final fuse. In the streets of Tehran, the clashes between protesters and the remaining loyalist forces became battles. The battles became wars. The wars became massacres. The IRGC, using snipers and mortars and, in some of the most horrific reports, chemical agents, began a systematic campaign to clear the streets. They fired into crowds of unarmed civilians. They stormed hospitals to drag away the wounded. They set up checkpoints and executed anyone whose identity papers suggested they might be a threat. The world watched in horror, broadcast live on satellite television and streamed on social media as the Islamic Republic of Iran tore itself apart. The international response was a study in paralysis and hypocrisy. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session, but the divisions that had paralyzed it for years were only deepened by the crisis. Russia and China, seeing an opportunity to weaken their American rival, blocked any resolution that condemned the Iranian government's actions, instead blaming the United States and Israel for the illegal aggression that had sparked the chaos. The European Union has always called for restraint and dialogue, offering to mediate a solution that no one on either side wanted. The Arab states of the Persian Gulf, terrified that the chaos would spread across their borders, vacillated between condemning Iran and secretly reaching out to the various factions, trying to position themselves for whatever came next. And in the midst of this global paralysis, the human cost continued to mount. The images that emerged from Iran were not the images of war that the world had grown accustomed to. They were not images of soldiers and tanks and burning military installations. They were images of children pulled from the rubble of apartment buildings that had been hit by errant missiles. They were images of women, their bodies draped in the national flag, lying dead in the streets. They were images of old men, their faces etched with the pain of a lifetime, weeping over the bodies of their grandchildren. They were images of a civilization, one of the oldest and most sophisticated on earth, being reduced to ash and bone. The question that haunted every analyst, every politician, every ordinary person watching the tragedy unfold was a simple one. What happens now? The old order was dead, its corpse still twitching with the violent reflexes of a lifetime. The new order had not yet been born, and the labor was proving to be fatal. In the absence of a clear successor, in the absence of a functioning state, in the absence of any semblance of the rule of law, Iran was reverting to something older, something more primal. It was reverting to tribe, to sect, to family. It was fragmenting along lines that had been drawn centuries before the Islamic Republic was ever conceived, lines that the revolution had papered over but never erased. In the north, the Azeri minority, long resentful of Persian dominance, began to talk openly of secession, of joining their ethnic kin in the newly assertive Republic of Azerbaijan. In the west, the Kurds, who had been promised autonomy 100 times and betrayed 100 times more, saw their chance and took it, seizing control of cities like Sanandaj and Mahabad, declaring a free Kurdistan that stretched from the Zagros to the Turkish border. In the south, the Arabs of Khuzestan, whose oil had fueled the Iranian economy for a century, raised the flags of their own ancestral tribes and appealed to their brethren across the Shat al-Arab in Iraq for support. And in the center, in Tehran and Qom and Isfahan, the rump of the Persian state, the core of what had once been an empire, fought a desperate, bloody, multi-front war against all of them. The Iranian military, what was left of it, found itself not defending the nation against a foreign enemy, but trying to hold the nation together against itself. Soldiers who had sworn an oath to protect Iran from external threats were ordered to fire on Iranians who simply wanted to govern themselves. Officers who had trained their entire lives to fight the Americans and the Israelis were forced to confront a reality in which the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, a hydra with 1,000 heads, each one wearing the face of a fellow citizen. The weeks that followed the death of the supreme leader were not a war in the conventional sense. They were a breaking. They were the sound of a civilization snapping in two. The world watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a nation of 80 million people descended into a chaos from which there might be no return. The optimists, the ones who always believe that history bends toward justice, pointed to the protesters in the streets, to the women dancing in the smoke, to the young men who stood in front of tanks with nothing but their bare hands. They saw the birth of freedom. The pessimists, the realists, the ones who had studied the bloody history of revolution, pointed to the bodies in the rubble, to the snipers on the rooftops, to the militias roaming the countryside with lists of names. They saw the birth of something else. They saw the birth of a darkness that would engulf not just Iran, but the entire region for generations to come. And in the midst of it all, in the silence that follows every explosion, in the quiet that falls over every battlefield when the shooting stops and the dying begins, there was a question that no one could answer. It was the question that haunted the dreams of presidents and the nightmares of refugees. It was the question that would determine the fate of millions. With the head of the snake severed, with the old order dead and the new order not yet born, with the nation fragmenting into 1,000 pieces and the world watching in helpless horror, one simple, terrifying question hung in the air like smoke: who or what would rise from the ashes? The answer, when it came, would not be spoken in the language of diplomacy or democracy. It would be written in the only language that war understands. It would be written in blood.